Well, thank you, Shaban, and to the Barrington Public Library for co-sponsoring and hosting tonight's program. Very much appreciated. As she mentioned, I'm with East Bay Students for Peace. We are a grassroots, nonpartisan peace and justice group that started a little over 23 years ago in response to the imminent U.S. attack on Iraq and also to the attack on our civil liberties through the Patriot Act. We hold monthly vigils every second Saturday of the month from 11 to 12 in front of the Bristol Public Post Office. And we put on events like tonight's talk. We also sponsor discussion groups, workshops, and we collaborate with other peace and justice groups. So we really look forward to having more people involved. There's a way to sign up and be on our email list and get more information about us afterwards. But I'm not going to waste any more time about East Bay Students for Peace because tonight we have an extremely important speaker. And if you don't know anything about him, don't be modest. He's an award-winning foreign correspondent who's covered more than 50 countries in 5 continents. You're impressed already? His articles and books have led the Washington Post to place him among the best in popular foreign policy storytelling. Kinzer spent more than 20 years working for the New York Times, most of it as a foreign correspondent. His postings in Nicaragua, Germany, and Turkey placed him at the center of historic events and at times in the line of conflict. His books include, no, I'm having trouble. Among them, okay, this is important. Among them is All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. He is now a senior fellow at the Watson School of International and Public Affairs at Brown University and writes a world affairs column at the Globe. And we're really, really honored to have you here, Stephen Kinzer. Looking forward to hearing your talk, and there'll be time for Q&A afterwards. Very good.
Well, thank you for all that. I really admire Nancy and the organization that she helps run. If there were more people like her and more organizations like that in more towns in America, this would be a much better country. So you're really setting an example, and I just wish more would follow it. I also have to say that although I always enjoy speaking to groups like this, or any kind of groups that don't have unripe fruits in their bags, I want to especially say that I enjoy being in libraries. I've written 10 books, I've researched 100 topics, and without libraries and librarians, I would never have been able to do that. So I have a huge admiration for librarians, and since I can't thank all those in America, I just want to thank Siobhan and tell her that you're the recipient, you're the vessel. So this past semester at Brown, the spring semester, I taught a seminar about Iran. And at the beginning of the semester, I told my students, you probably can hardly imagine this, and I can hardly imagine this, but wrap your mind around this. By the time we finish this semester, the United States might be at war with Iran. And it was something that no one in the room could really imagine, including me, but of course it did happen. So the sales of my book about Iran, All the Shah's Men, have skyrocketed. I think that other than arms makers, I'm probably one of the few people that benefits from all of this war in the Middle East. But speaking of books, I want to tell you a story about one of my books that you'll never read because I'm never going to write it. Not so long ago, I came up with the idea that, well, I want to write a memoir. So as you heard, I've been a New York Times foreign correspondent. I had lots of adventures. I was in wild places. I met the people that you read about in books. So I went to my publisher and said, I've got the bestseller. I'm going to write my memoir. I tell all my stories. And he said, terrible idea. The only people who ever buy books by former foreign correspondents our other former foreign correspondents, and that's too small an audience. I was quite taken aback, and I thought he couldn't have gotten this right. And for the first time in my publishing career, I actually went to another publisher, and I said, this idiot told me this, but I want to tell you, I'm going to write my memoir, and he said the exact same thing. So I came to realize that I'm actually not going to write a memoir. However, I did get to the point of coming up with a title. Most of my books work the other way. I write a book, and at some point along the way, or after I finish it, I come up with a title. In this case, I have a title for a book that's never going to be written. And it's a title that encapsulates my whole approach to the world. It's a line from a movie. It's one of those old screwball comedies that some of you may remember called Arsenic and Old Lace. Remember that one? I can see we're in the right generation. Sometimes I get a blank when I mention that at Brown. So in that movie, as you'll remember, the story is that Cary Grant goes to visit his elderly aunts, and slowly, they run a rooming house. Slowly he discovers that they poison the elderly gentlemen who are guests there. So at one point, one of the elderly aunts says to Cary Grant, "Oh, the gentleman died because he drank wine that had poison in it." And Cary Grant's eyes kind of widen, and he says, "But how did the poison get in the wine?" That's the title of my memoir. The wine of Iran-American friendship has been poisoned. But how did the poison get in the wine? I want to try to unpack that and see if we can come up with some answers going back into deep history and taking us right up to today. So Iran, as many of you know, is one of the world's oldest civilizations, along with China, maybe India, you could argue. But it goes back 3,000 to 4,000 years. That's why they kind of smirk at countries like the United States that just got here yesterday, trying to tell us how the world should operate. And Iran's history completely and deeply shapes its approach to the world, which I think is probably true for most countries. Iran has had a long history of resisting foreign invasion. It's one of the threads that runs all the way through Iran's deep history. Some of you may know about the great ruin at Persepolis, the old ceremonial capital of Iran, ancient Persia. It was destroyed by Alexander the Great. That was about 2,400 years ago. You can still go there. It's a deeply impressive place. Even though he set it on fire, a lot of it still survives. I actually, not long ago, read a memoir by an Iranian woman, and she said that when my parents took me to Persepolis for the first time, that's when I realized that being Iranian means that you are part of something grand and magnificent. Iranians have a very deep sense of their culture and their history. It's something that's very difficult to understand when you come from the Americas. My very first trip to Iran, I went there from Istanbul, where I was the New York Times bureau chief. I had been assigned to cover a variety of countries, and I was studying about all of them, but Iran wasn't one of them. And suddenly, because of a combination of circumstances, I was sent to Iran. Now, I never was a Middle East expert, but one thing I know about the Middle East is that most countries in the Middle East are made-up countries. They're fake countries that were designed by some British diplomat sitting in a men's club on Pall Mall writing lines on a map. So there's no such thing as a Jordanian history or the other countries in that region are really new. They're all invented by Westerners. Now, the cities, of course, have huge traditions. Cairo, Damascus, Beirut, these are ancient capitals. But the countries there are still searching for identities. So what is Iraq? What is Syria? These are kind of modern inventions in which provinces were pushed together for reasons that didn't have anything to do with local realities. When I got to Iran, it didn't take me long to realize this is the opposite of a fake country. This is a real country with very, very deep roots. And one of the first things, first moments I realized this was I went to a museum, one of the National Museum in Tehran, and I was with my Persian interpreter, and we were walking through and we saw a large piece of calligraphy in a frame. So I was coming from Turkey. In Turkey, Kemal Ataturk changed the script in the 1920s. It used to be Arabic script. Now it's the Roman script that we use. What it means is that no Turk can read anything that was written before the 1920s because that was in another script that they don't know. So I looked at this piece of calligraphy in the National Museum in Iran. It was 1,000 years old. And I turned to my interpreter and said, "Can you read this?" And she looked at it and said, yeah, I can read it. I can say what it says. That's 1,000 years ago. Iranians have a very deep understanding and consciousness of their history. In fact, I've never been to any country where the consciousness is that deep, and the connection to the homeland and the history and the culture is that deep. The role of poetry in Iran is immense. Every house has a book of the poetry of Hafez, Sadi, Rumi. All these great poets have helped shape the Persian identity. The great Persian epic, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, is something that has deeply shaped Iran's conception of itself. You still have many people in Iran named after characters from the Shahnameh. So this is a country that is very different from all the countries around it in many, many ways. Now, I mentioned the theme of foreign intervention. As I said, Alexander the Great was one of the first who came in trying to wreck Iran. And I still remember a time when I was visiting the tomb of Cyrus the Great, one of the really great monarchs in world history. And he's in a very simple tomb that he arranged for himself. And there's a kind of a park around it, or an empty field, and Iranians often go there to have picnics, especially on weekends. The families are there. So I went there once, and Iranians are so hospitable. You don't even want to make any eye contact because they're going to invite you, and you have to go. So they're having picnics, and I naturally had to sit with one group after another. And I asked one Iranian guy who invited me down to sit with his family about Iranian history, and he said, "All of our troubles began with that Greek Alexander." They still have that consciousness. Flash forward another 1,000 years. Arab conquest of Iran. The Arabs forced Iran to become Muslim. They had always been Zoroastrian. They had a completely different religion and a much different view of life. But Iranians, being a culture that was able to resist and absorb even the Hellenic culture of Alexander the Great, although they had to submit and accept Islam, created a form of Islam of their own, Shi'ism. So they submitted while resisting, in a sense. So Shia Islam is a binding force in Iranian consciousness. Without going into the deep history of Shi'ism, its two leading figures, Ali and Hussein, were imams who believed that they were, because they were related to Muhammad, the logical successors to Muhammad. But there was a clash, and their faction lost out, and both of them were murdered in different ways. This gave Shi'ism the beginnings of a culture in which martyring yourself in a just cause is considered a supreme virtue. And sacrificing yourself for the nation and for something great and beautiful is considered an integral part of Iranian identity. So we can go further ahead after the Arab conquest. There was the Mongol hordes came over in the 13th century and also devastated Iran. Then go up to the 19th century. Iran was ruled by a weak and corrupt dynasty in those days, and the British and the Russians in particular were pecking at the weak body of Iran, sliced away huge parts of its territory. The entire western third of Afghanistan today used to be part of Iran, was ripped away by the British, who then controlled Afghanistan. The Caucasus, much of Georgia and Azerbaijan was part of Iran. That was ripped away by the Russians. So the 19th century was a period when Iran was attacked by outsiders. Yet again, it reinforced this view that we are always the victim of big outside powers, but we always resist and we still survive because of the coherence of our identity. So then we move into the beginning of the 20th century. In the first decade of the 20th century, there was a revolution in Iran, the constitutional revolution. That was a rebellion against the rule of Shahs, the rule of kings. Iran emerged from that with a constitution. So Iran has had a constitution for more than 100 years. There are other countries in the Middle East that even today don't have a constitution. There was the beginnings of democracy in Iran, but the country was so weak and was being so incessantly attacked by outside powers that finally the country almost seemed on the verge of collapse. It was really ready for a great man on horseback. And he arrived. That was Reza Shah. Reza Shah took over in the 1920s and established himself. He actually was a great admirer of Ataturk in Turkey, and he wanted to become a secular president, just like Ataturk. But the religious establishment in Iran was horrified at this idea, especially since Ataturk had just abolished the Muslim caliphate. And so Reza, who began life as an illiterate stable boy, decided that if I can't be president and you insist on having a king, I'll be the king. And he made himself into Reza Shah. During the 1930s, Reza brought Iran back to life. He, in many ways, was a version of Ataturk. He was a harsh, authoritarian dictator, but a tremendous modernizer. He's the one who started building schools and made sure they were all open to girls as well as boys. He's the one that began building ports, rail lines, bridges. One of his quirks was he wouldn't take any loans from any foreign country. He wanted to build a rail line, but no money in the treasury. So what did he do? He called on Iranians, come and donate your money. And the women were lining up to give their jewelry. Men were coming with all the coins they had at home. And that whole Trans-Iran Railroad was built by donations from Iranians. The British told the Iranians that they didn't have engineers trained enough to build the main bridges that would connect the various parts of the rail line. So reluctly, Reza agreed to allow the British engineers to build the bridges, but with a condition. Each British engineer and his family had to sit under the bridge the first time a train went over it, just to be sure. Reza wouldn't allow his diplomats to attend receptions in any embassy because he knew that they were going to be suborned and approached and bribed. He made all the signs to be written in Persian, no English anymore. In fact, one day he even announced that He wasn't going to accept any mail that was addressed to Persia anymore. Iran, we're Iran, we're not Persia. That idea is something that the British have maintained. And in classic Reza style, he ordered that to be imposed today, so that all the mail that came in over the next few months everything had to be sent back. So Reza really pulled Iran back to life. He was a harsh dictator, but a great modernizer. For example, he created the first modern university in Iran, and the first school that he established was the medical school. And I sometimes ask my students, so why would he have established the medical school first? And they don't guess the answer. I'm not going to test all of you. The answer is that in Islam, traditional Islam, cutting up a body for any reason after it's dead is strictly forbidden. In a medical school, you do autopsies every day. You open up bodies, that's what you do. So he wanted that to be the first thing that was done, just to show what he felt about traditional Islam. So Reza was a great modernizer. Towards the end of his life, unlike Ataturk, he developed a very authoritarian, his authoritarianism overwhelmed him. Then World War II happened. The Allied powers invaded, and the British particularly insisted that Reza become their puppet. He refused to do that. He was just not made to be anybody's puppet. So the British dethroned him and sent him off into exile to South Africa, where he finally died. Then, after the Second World War ended, the British were leaving. They wanted to concentrate on other more important projects like India. And they wanted to leave behind someone who could administer the country for them. They looked around. The first guy they found was a prince from the old Qajar dynasty. And they approached him, but he was living in Britain. He was an officer in the Royal Navy, and he didn't speak Persian. So they decided that one isn't going to work. Then they decided to look for someone else, and someone thought of Reza Shah's son, who was living kind of a dissolute life in southern France, hanging around at casinos with French girls. And they went to find him and told him, we could make you king. And then all you'd have to do is agree to do everything we say. And naturally, he agreed. So that's how we got Mohammad Reza Shah, the one that we all remember. Now, once the British were gone, the Iranians immediately had the idea, we want to go back to our constitution. The constitution had not been really respected under Reza, but it was still there. And so they went back to democracy, and they began to make it real. They had real elections. They elected a real parliament, and that parliament produced a real leader. Mohammad Mossadegh became the prime minister of Iran. So here you have the beginnings of a real democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East. So Mossadegh, being democratically elected, had to respond to popular will. And the overwhelming popular will in Iran dictated two things. Number one, Shah may reign like the Queen of England, but not rule. Shah must be only a symbol, and decisions must be made by officials chosen by the voters. And number two, we must resolve the overwhelming injustice of Iranian life. We are sitting on a vast ocean of oil, but the Iranian oil industry at that time was owned 100% by a British company. It was owned in turn mainly by the British government. So all during the 1920s and 30s and 40s, every factory in Britain was fueled by oil from Iran. Every bus and every lorry in every car in Britain was running on oil from Iran. The Royal Navy which projected British power around the world, was fueled 100% by oil from Iran. Meanwhile, Iranians were living in some of the most miserable conditions of any people on earth. So it was natural that the giant priority for Iran was, we got to take back control of our oil. And Mossadegh rose through parliament. He had been chairman of the oil committee. And when he became prime minister, this became his central focus. There's a wonderful scene. I always imagine this in my mind. And if there's ever a movie made about that period, I want to direct this one scene. So Mossadegh was a member of parliament when the prime minister of Iran was assassinated, and the parliament had to choose a new leader. Mossadegh was the dominant figure. Mossadegh had become the treasurer of one province of Iran when he was 17. And he was always recognized as a person with impeccable honesty. But during the Reza period, he resigned from power. He just went back to his village. He went off to Switzerland. He's the first Iranian to get a PhD in law from a European university. Finally, after the war, he came back to Iran. He entered parliament, already an older man, became chairman of the oil committee. And then at this moment, when the prime minister was assassinated, naturally all eyes turned to Mossadegh. However, the British were terrified of him. They hated him. And several of the members of parliament were on the British payroll. One of them got up and made a speech assailing Mossadegh and telling him something like this: "You're one of those people who always likes to criticize and denounce and accuse. You don't want to take any power for yourself. You just want to be the one that's always throwing stones at everyone else." So Mossadegh, who was very, very tall, rose out of his seat and said, I want to thank my colleague for nominating me for prime minister, and I accept. And then, as the applause faded away, he said, but there's a condition. And very dramatically, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, and he said, "This is the law authorizing the nationalization of our oil. First, approve this, and then I will become your prime minister and make it real." And that's exactly what happened. So Mossadegh became prime minister. It was the first and lamentably only time that Iran had a real democracy. And with a unanimous vote of parliament, Iran nationalized its great resource. This horrified the British, needless to say. The great refinery they had built at Abadan in southern Iran was the most valuable, most expensive British installation anywhere in the world. And as I said, it became a fundamental foundation of British power and British prosperity. So the British could hardly accept this. They went through a whole series of ideas of how to respond to this. Of course, the first one was to send a note from London to the British ambassador in Tehran and ask him, how much money does Mossadegh want to have us put in his Swiss bank account so that he forgets this foolishness? And of course, the ambassador replied, that's not going to work with Mossadegh. You can't bribe him that way. So then the British embarked on a whole series of measures. First thing they did was to decide that they would close the refinery and stop refining any oil. So under terms of the original corrupt treaty that was signed by one of these old Qajar monarchs decades earlier, the British promised to train Iranians in the technical jobs of running the refinery. But of course, they never did that. So there were no Iranians who could run the refinery. The British decided that they would require all their employees at Abadan to go home. Mossadegh offered all of them the chance to stay at the same salaries and with all the same benefits, and many of them wanted to stay. Actually, it was a lot nicer living in this elite colonial enclave where you had beautiful trimmed lawns and no Iranians allowed, tennis courts and buses, instead of going back to the misty Midlands. But the British wouldn't allow that. They required every British employee to leave the refinery. Then Mossadegh began looking in other countries for oil experts who would come to Iran and help them run the refinery. The British began putting advertisements in newspapers around the world in places where there were collections of oil experts saying that oil is British property, and anybody who helps Iran extract it is participating in a global theft, and we will prosecute that person. Actually, there were even some Americans who wanted to go, but President Truman, at the request of the British, refused to allow them to do so. Then, since there was still some oil already pumped and waiting to be exported at Abadan, the British imposed a blockade around Abadan to make sure that Iran could not export any oil. Then the British imposed what we would today call sanctions. They froze Iranian assets in London banks. They refused to send everything from tea to steel to cement to Iran. Then they decided, when none of this worked, that they would take Mossadegh to the United Nations. The UN was then a young organization. It was completely dominated by the permanent members of the Security Council. And so the British submitted a resolution at the Security Council under which the UN would order Mossadegh to give back the so-called stolen oil to its British owners. So Mossadegh did something that nobody had expected, which was he decided he would go to New York and protest and speak at the United Nations. Now, it was very hard to get from Iran to New York in those days. And bear in mind, this was the first time that the leader of any developing country, any resource-producing country, had spoken on such a stage. This was before Lumumba, before Castro, before Sukarno. So Mossadegh got to New York and gave moving speeches about how unjust it was for the British to try to continue sucking the oil out of Iran and preventing Iranians from benefiting from it. He was so persuasive that for the first time in the then short history of the UN, the Security Council refused to accept a proposal by one of its permanent members, the British. So they refused to order Mossadegh to give the oil back. Then the British decided they would take Mossadegh to the World Court in The Hague. And Mossadegh actually went there also. And the World Court also refused to go along with what the British wanted. Mossadegh made quite an impression in America. One of the things that he wanted to do was to visit sites related to the American Revolution. There's a wonderful picture of him in Philadelphia. He's standing next to the mayor, who was Jewish, and he's got his hand in the crack of the Liberty Bell. And then he wanted to go to Mount Vernon. And when he got there, he made a kind of impromptu speech saying, "We in Iran are trying to do just what George Washington did. Free ourselves from foreign domination. And what a coincidence! We're trying to free ourselves from the same country that George Washington wanted to free you from." Mossadegh was quite successful in this campaign to resist British pressure. But bearing in mind the way the world was in those days, his resistance was ill-fated. So first of all, the British had tried to stage what they called a legal coup against Mossadegh. And the way they would do this is to foment a no-confidence vote in Parliament. They had a lot of members of the Parliament on their payroll, and the idea was a number of them would vote to remove Mossadegh, and then it would be seemingly legal. However, Iran being a small town in those days, Mossadegh caught wind of this, and before the Parliament could act, Mossadegh closed the British embassy and he expelled all British diplomats. That included all of these intelligence agents who were bribing the members of the British Parliament. So he survived that. But then the British, in a panic, were trying to think, we can't accept this. We have to find something. Right around this time, it was in the end of November of 1952, the CIA Middle East director, Kermit Roosevelt, was on his way back from a visit to the Middle East to Washington, to his CIA office, and he stopped in London. And his counterparts in MI6, the British Secret Service, asked him in a panic, what can we do? We have to do something to stop Mossadegh. And Roosevelt told them, Truman will not accept this. In fact, Truman had specifically rejected proposals from the CIA that they launch a project to overthrow Mossadegh. However, there's just been an election in the United States, and the new group under Eisenhower might be more open to your idea. So the British didn't have any more secret agents. All their spies had been expelled, although they still had an infrastructure of people that had worked with them over years. So the British were so excited at this prospect that they couldn't even wait for Eisenhower to be inaugurated. Even before the inauguration, they sent an envoy to Washington. And this guy, Christopher Montague Woodhouse, had been the head of the British Secret Service Bureau in Iran before Mossadegh closed it and threw them all out. He's written a memoir. He had a very colorful life. He did a lot of other things. But in his memoir, he has a couple of pages about this mission to Washington. And if I can paraphrase what he said, it was something like this. I was flying over and trying to figure out how to convince the Americans that they should come to our aid and overthrow Mossadegh for us. And I began to realize that the argument we've been using is not going to work. That argument is, this madman took away our oil, please overthrow him so we can have our oil back. The Americans are not going to respond to that. But he said, knowing the mood in Washington, I decided to make a completely different argument. I decided not even to mention oil, and just to say, Mossadegh is leading Iran toward communism. Now, Mossadegh was an elderly feudal landlord who despised all socialist and Marxist ideas. And in fact, we now have a really good paper trail of all declassified documents about this coup. And from that, we can tell that there was one moment when an objection was raised to the idea of a coup in Iran. And it was at a National Security Council meeting. The person who raised the objection was President Eisenhower, who said, I'd like to give that guy $50 million. And he then questioned his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, about why. He said something like, I'm glad we're getting rid of this communist Mossadegh, but I didn't understand really that he was a communist. And Dulles had a great answer. He said, well, of course, Mossadegh is not a communist, but Mossadegh is old. Mossadegh is sick. Mossadegh could die. He could be overthrown. Iran has a lot of oil. It's on the border with the Soviet Union. It's just too much of a risk. And Eisenhower was persuaded by that. So the United States set in motion a project called Operation Ajax to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran. And Kermit Roosevelt was named to be the director of the project. He's actually the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, which makes me wonder if overthrowing governments might not be a genetic trait that passed down through generations. Kermit Roosevelt crossed over into Iran under a false name at the beginning of August in 1953 and immediately set to work. Actually, in researching this story, I came to understand how you overthrow governments. So what do you do? I sometimes think if this journalism and professor thing doesn't work out, I got a great consultancy project, how to overthrow governments. So you get there on Monday morning, 9 o'clock, you sit down at your desk, and what do you do? Well, now I see everything that Kermit Roosevelt did. One of the first things he did was to set out to bribe newspaper editors and columnists. Next thing you know, articles were appearing in the Iranian press denouncing Mossadegh. Nobody in Iran had ever heard anything bad about Mossadegh. Next thing they know, he's a Jew, he's a British agent, he's an atheist, he's a communist. Some of these articles were actually written in Washington at the CIA headquarters and sent to Iran. In fact, we have a wonderful book by Richard Cottam, who was one of the CIA officers in Iran at the time. And he tells this great story about there being a group of people working on Iran at the CIA, but only a few of them knew they were planning a coup. The others were just monitoring information. And he said one time, a guy raced over across the hall from me and held up an Iranian newspaper. And he said, wow, you won't believe, look how the Iranian newspapers are denouncing Mossadegh. Look at this story. And Cottam writes, I couldn't tell him, I wrote that story. He wrote it there. It was then sent to Iran. It was published, and then the newspaper came back to the same office. Kermit Roosevelt also bribed mullahs to denounce Mossadegh from their pulpits. He bribed military officers to be ready to stage a coup. And it only took Kermit Roosevelt about 3 weeks in August of 1953 to carry out that coup and secure the overthrow of Mossadegh. That happened at the end of August 1953. So this was not only the overthrow of one leader, it was the end of democracy in Iran forever. If we had not done that, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these 70 years. And I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the world and the Middle East might be had we done that. This didn't only affect Iran. All the rising leaders in the countries around Iran, all the Middle Eastern leaders took a lesson from that coup. And the lesson was, if you want support from the Americans, do not have democracy. They don't want democracy because it's going to give them trouble. What you really want is an authoritarian dictatorship that will provide them with the oil that they want. Now, the motivations of the Americans had a lot to do with this economic base. So for the British, they were afraid of losing their greatest economic asset in the world. But for Foster Dulles and his brother Alan, who was head of the CIA at the same time, the Iran situation posed an even greater challenge. It represented the first effort by a country that produced resources to take control of its own resources and decide that it was going to set the prices and the conditions by which those resources could be exported and shared with the world. The Dulles brothers, who had spent their lives at this great law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, representing all of the major American multinational corporations, recognized this as a profound threat. It could spread around the world. All countries that produced resources could follow this example. And if they did, the whole economic system by which the world is governed would be destroyed. The rich countries would not be able to sack and loot those resources under the conditions that they would set. The producing countries would set the conditions. So it wasn't just about Iran. I think the Dulles brothers saw this very much as a global threat to the multinational corporations that they'd spent their lives defending, and on which they believed America's prosperity depended. So, let's spin forward from that moment in 1953. We got, in the short run, that coup seemed like a tremendous success for the Americans. We got rid of a guy we didn't like, Mossadegh, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we wanted. So let me just explain the detail that the first coup against Mossadegh failed, and the Shah fled the country. He went to Iraq, and then he wound up in Rome. And in Rome, he even told reporters that he thought he'd have to get a job because he'd certainly never be able to go back to Iran again. But Kermit Roosevelt, who was kind of a modern-day James Bond, decided, I'm going to stay here and try again. And 4 days later, there was a second attempt, and it succeeded. When I was writing my book, All the Shah's Men, I had a dinner with Kermit Roosevelt's son. He had two sons, and they've split. One of them thinks his father did a great thing. The other one, who became a state senator in Massachusetts, and then I think he was president of Antioch College, was very horrified by what his father had done. And I was sitting with him, and he said, I told him, your father manipulated this in such a brilliant way. And he said, that's so strange because my father was a complete klutz. My father couldn't do anything. He couldn't even change a light bulb or change the needle on a phonograph record. But I said to him, well, there was one thing he was good at. So we brought the Shah back. We placed him on the peacock throne, from which he had fled. He then ruled, as we all remember, for 25 years with increasing repression. That repression produced the explosion of the late 1970s, what we call the Islamic Revolution, and that brought to power a clique of fanatically anti-Western mullahs who spent the next 40-plus years working intently and sometimes very violently to undermine American interests all over the world. There's a version of U.S.-Iran relations that Americans know, and there's a version of U.S.-Iran relations that Iranians know. They're totally different. They never intersect. They're like two train tracks that run alongside but never come together. So, for the Americans, the beginning and end of all U.S.-Iran relations was the hostage crisis. It still scars Americans. I was giving a speech just about a year ago on Boston Common, outdoors, we were protesting something about Iran. Seems to be an eternal project. And there was a heckler. Somebody was shouting from the edge of the crowd, and I tried to ignore him, but finally I stopped and listened, and what he was saying over and over again, he's going, hostage crisis, hostage crisis, hostage crisis. So, as we all remember, that had a huge psychological effect on the United States, and it poisoned U.S.-Iran relations forever. And that's, for the Americans, the central moment when everything went wrong. But Iranians don't see it that way. For Iranians, that was just a blip. Nobody was killed. It was an unfortunate episode. But the real moment when everything went wrong was 1953, when the Americans came in and destroyed Iranian democracy. When I made that first trip to Iran, to which I earlier referred, I remember thinking to myself something that I ask myself in many countries that I go to visit, and certainly when I went to visit as a reporter. How did this country get to be this way? So why is this country rich and powerful? Why is this country poor and miserable? How did it get that way? When I got to Iran, I was immediately struck by what an immense difference there is between what Iran should be, given its culture and its history and the brilliance of its population, and what Iran is, which is poor and isolated and unhappy. How could there be such a vast difference? Why didn't Iran ever get to consolidate a normal, free, open democracy? And I started asking people in my ignorance. And Iranians are very polite. They don't like to insult you. But I finally did find one guy who leaned over to me nicely and said, we did have a democracy here once until you showed up and took it away from us. At that moment, I decided I had vaguely heard something happened in Iran in 1953. And I made a mental note. As soon as I get home back to Istanbul, I'm going to find a book. I want to read about what happened. Imagine my surprise to realize there was no such book. That episode is totally forgotten by Americans. If you read a history of the 20th century, it might be one little footnote. And I think it's because Americans, like most people, only like to think of their history in terms of all the positive things they've done. So I decided the only way I would ever be able to read a book about that episode would be to write it myself. And that's how I produced All the Shah's Men. So that's how the poison got into the wine. Americans, up until 1953, had the image of saints in Iran. First Americans to arrive in Iran came in the 19th century. They were Protestant missionaries, but they were never seeking to convert Muslims. They were trying to set a good example of what Christians could do. They established the first serious modern hospitals in Iran. They established the education system, including Al-Borz College, which educated several generations of the Iranian elite. And while the British and the Russians, and to some extent the French, were picking Iran apart and looting it, the Americans seemed like Prince Charming. All they came for was to help. And that was the way Iranians looked at Americans up until 1953. So that takes us up through the period of the overthrow of the Shah. During the 1980s, Iran had to fight another war against another invader, and that was Iraq. That war lasted for 8 years during the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War. The Iranians took 1 million casualties. It's something that's very deeply part of the Iranian modern consciousness. Wherever you go in Iran, there are martyrs' cemeteries. There are always mothers weeping at graves. Not even now, decades later, photographs of the martyrs are on walls everywhere. The United States was on a path of deep hostility to Iran. There were some moments when it seemed like things might get better. Actually, Ronald Reagan made an effort, which came to nothing. George H.W. Bush even used that phrase, goodwill begets goodwill, talking about Iran. And then finally, we had a real breakthrough with Barack Obama. The signing of the JCPOA, the joint, what we call the nuclear deal with Iran, was a moment when it seemed like we had turned off the path of confrontation. That was a highly complex negotiation, took almost 2 years. The final JCPOA agreement is 150 pages long, extremely detailed about what Iran could and couldn't do and what kinds of inspections would have to be carried out in the Iranian nuclear program. And it really seemed like we had now resolved the Iran problem, or at least we're on the road to resolving it. Then, of course, Donald Trump came to power. He withdrew the United States from that agreement, which was a terrible mistake. And that, again, set the two countries on the path to confrontation. That brings us up to the modern moment. So, with the urging of his friends in Israel and Israel's friends in the United States, President Trump decided that he would try to resolve the problem in Iran by bombing. I think he had maybe gotten a sense of enthusiasm by what had just happened in Venezuela, where it just took a couple of days and he got rid of the guy he didn't like, and put in someone that would do what we wanted. But he didn't understand, Iran is not Venezuela. In fact, the Iranians had been working ever since the Iraq War, so for decades, on a project they call Mosaic Defense. They've divided the country into 32 different regions. Each region has its own commander. If the top is decapitated, their local commanders can do what they want. And that has to do with not just military, but also civilian affairs. The whole idea was we know that we're subject to attack. And all of the leaders of the country could be killed. But we have to work out a system that doesn't destroy the country and the regime. So as you all know, the United States and Israel launched attacks in which most of the senior leaders of Iran were killed. But nothing happened to the regime. In fact, the regime was able to resist. and was able to fight back. In fact, I think maybe the emblematic comment of the whole war that I remember from Trump was, "We couldn't believe it, they fought back." It shows you the ignorance on which these policies are based. The idea that a foreign power can come into Iran and impose its will is only possible to believe when you know nothing about the history and traditions and culture and resistance history of Iran. So that effort to destroy the Islamic Republic by decapitating it failed miserably. But it not only failed, it produced an entire new Iran. The old generation is gone. There's a new generation. It's not only the kids that fought in the Iraq War, but their kids. The old generation, symbolized by the Ayatollah Khomeini and Khamenei, were the ones who were veterans of the fight against the Shah. And they spent decades trying to defend themselves and showing that what they did was right. It was okay to overthrow the Shah. This was a good revolution. The new group has no memory of the Shah period. They don't feel any need to defend themselves for anything. We have now, with our policy, placed in power a group that is highly nationalistic. Now they hand out pins to everybody with just the little map of Iran. It's not Islam anymore, it's nationalism. And the people who have many of the people who have protested against the Islamic Republic, and I think still detest it, have come to realize that it was the Islamic Republic that saved us. They protected us. They won. They protected us from being overrun and defeated. So this is the government that we have, and we have to support it. I think this happens in every country. When your country is bombed, you rally behind your leaders. I remember when George W. Bush had popularity of 95% after the 9/11 attacks. It's just a natural reaction. So we now have an Iran that is feeling itself more powerful than ever. Everyone understood that if Iran was pushed too hard, it would try to take control of the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone except the people in the Trump administration. And now Iran not only has control of this jugular for the world economy, but it has made conditions for peace that not only include Iran, but also even include Iran's favored groups in places like Lebanon. They're not going to accept peace with the United States unless Israel stops bombing Lebanon. So they've now expanded their ambition. This is a new group, a new generation that has come to power as a result of this war, just in recent months. And I think they feel flushed with success. They feel like they've entered into a new era in the Middle East. They are wanting to chase the United States out of the Persian Gulf, and there's already signs that that is happening. We haven't got full reports yet, but a number of American bases have been seriously damaged. And the message Iran is giving to the countries of the Persian Gulf is, you make yourself vulnerable to us by having American bases in your country. If you want to be peaceful and safe, get rid of the Americans. So we're now at a moment of great transition, a moment in which Iran feels itself tremendously empowered, and a moment in which the United States has caused itself tremendous loss of strategic power, not just in that region, but around the world, as people see how wrong it was to believe the United States was all powerful. You know, Joe Biden had this great line, "We're the United States of America. We can do anything." It's now clear that that isn't true. And we're now in a new era in Iran. And I told my students at the end of the semester, I didn't think it would happen. None of you thought it would happen. But here we are, and we're in a completely new era. So let me hold it right there and then ask if any of you have any questions. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. So do you think that when Witkoff and Kushner went to wherever in Pakistan, I think, to hold talks about the nuclear issue, and they didn't take any experts with them. That's indicative that there was never any deal to be made.
So the question was about Witkoff and Kushner going to the Middle East just on their own. I mean, I followed the nuclear negotiations that John Kerry and Javad Zarif carried out for so long. This is a highly complex issue. And a guy who's some relative of the president and his golf partner together are just not the right people to negotiate a major international deal. It's actually kind of laughable. You know, the Iranian leadership is highly sophisticated. Half of the members of the cabinet have PhDs. You know, they're very, very sophisticated. The foreign minister has written 3 long papers on Kant. How many papers on Kant do you think Jared Kushner has written or read? Now I did see one encouraging note just in the last couple of days that those 2 guys actually went down to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where we have our big nuclear center, and decided for the first time, gee, maybe we ought to talk to some nuclear scientists about this. But I tell you, I don't think the Iranians are desperate to make a deal. I think the Americans are more eager to make a deal. The Iranians have given up on the idea of lifting sanctions. They don't care. The sanctions have devastated Iran. But the Iranian idea is, even if they lift them, they can put them on again. Our goal has to be to create a new economy that doesn't base itself on what Europe and America can provide. So I think the inequality between the intellectual and diplomatic quality of the American and Iranian negotiating teams is vast. Yes?
Do you think there's any possibility for some kind of treaty between the 2 countries? Because it took Obama 2 years something to do one, and now we expect to do one for 15 days.
So is there any possibility for a treaty? I would say no possibility for a treaty, but there might be an intermediate step, some kind of understanding, and they call that an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. There might be something like that, in which we could try to resolve some temporary issues and push off some other issues to the future. But I think one of the things the Americans have slowly come to realize is that the old paradigm where Iran is begging us for something is over. Well, Iran is happy. If there's no deal, that's fine. We rule now. I mean, it's amazing. The United States has empowered Iran to a position that Iran has not been in ever since the days of the Shah. And in those days, it was our lackey. For the first time in the modern history of Iran, it's a dominant power. I even saw an article in the New York Times saying it could be the 4th world power now after US, China, and Russia. Nobody would have thought of that even a year ago. So I do think there is the possibility of some kind of an understanding, but it's not going to be durable, and it's not going to be a treaty. The Iranians will never accept being dictated to again. And I think the Americans are slowly coming to realize this. And just going back to that Biden quote about we're America, we can do whatever we want. This is a big psychological challenge. It's not something the United States is used to. We're used to getting our way all the time. And I think maybe even beyond Iran, that's the biggest shock to the American psyche. Yes, sir.
Just maybe this is a softball, but going back to your Witkoff and Kushner response, what did you think of Trump saying that everybody had to join the Abraham Accords immediately?
Well, it's another great fantasy. Really, I think maybe he's got the Israel whisperer in his ear telling him that, I mean, this is what he was told. He was told, don't worry, we'll get rid of the top 20 guys and the whole regime will collapse and we'll put the Shah's son back in and he'll be a lackey of Israel and everything will be fine. But I truly believe that there is not going to be any long-term accord anytime soon between the U.S. and Iran. And the Iranians are fine with that. They feel like they've had a breakthrough. And what provided them with this tremendous opportunity to break out of their isolation? It was the U.S. and Israel attacking them. Yes?
What would an MOU look like?
What would an MOU look like? Well, first of all, I think it would probably put off a lot of issues, including the nuclear issue. It might require an end to attacks on both sides. I think there's no chance of Iran signing onto an accord that does not release the $24 billion in Iranian assets that are being held in U.S. banks and have been frozen. And that would require Trump to send billions of dollars to Iran. It's Iran's money. Nonetheless, that would be a politically complicated thing to explain. So I think that would probably be the first issue that would have to be resolved, even in a memorandum of understanding. And it wouldn't go back to the question of sanctions, which the Iranians have been harping on for many years. They're finished with that. They've just opened the new, I just read this the other day, the new train line from China to Iran has just been opened. Iran is finished with Europe and finished with America. They're looking at a new world, and the new world is looking at Iran in a new way. Yes?
Why did Truman deny it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Why did Truman deny
Why
it?
did Truman deny a coup? Very interesting. So Truman is the person who, first of all, decided at the end of the Second World War that the U.S. should not have a secret service. He abolished the OSS, which was our secret service during the Second World War. He didn't think America needed a secret service in peacetime. 2 years later, for a variety of reasons, he changed his mind. And in 1947, he signed the National Security Act that created the CIA. And he used the CIA in various actions, particularly in influencing the election in Italy in 1948. However, Truman drew the line at overthrowing governments. Allen Dulles, who became, as head of the CIA under Eisenhower, the person who organized and conceived the coup in Iran, and the coup in Guatemala that came just 10 months later, was already in the CIA when Truman was president. And he's the one who proposed not only that we stage a coup in Iran, but also that we stage a coup in Guatemala. And it was Truman who rejected that. Truman rejected the Iran idea. His Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, rejected the Guatemala idea by saying, there's nothing that could possibly happen in all of Latin America that would require us to stage a coup. So I think Truman might have had a certain view that Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers didn't have, and it was this. We can't really control the future of events. We don't know what this is going to lead to. That's such a drastic step. We shouldn't do that. And I think it leads to a truth that we've seen clearly in the history of American intervention. When you intervene violently in the politics of another country, you're doing something like releasing a wheel from the top of a hill. You can let it go, but you have no control over how it bounces or where it's ultimately going to end up. And I think maybe Truman had a little more humility about the ability of America to control events. My favorite quote from him is one that I use as the epigram for my book about the Shah, about the coup, All the Shah's Men. And that line from Truman is, the only thing new in this world is the history you didn't know. I want Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff to meditate on that one. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you feel that if our Congress is actually doing their job and it voted against having the war, and we were actually pulled out of Iran, that there would be a way to better negotiate a relationship that was beneficial?
So the question was about Congress. If Congress were more assertive, could that lead to a better relationship with Iran? Yeah, I think it could, but I don't see the prospect of that. I see Congress as having completely abdicated its constitutional responsibilities. You don't have to be a constitutional expert to read in the Constitution that only the Congress has the right to declare war. But ever since the Korean War, we forgot to do that. Congress doesn't want the responsibility anymore. And we saw that with Iraq War over and over, Afghanistan.
So I see Congress as being completely neutered. It's a pathetic institution. Sometimes I think we should just abolish it. It's just a figment of imagination. It's a kind of an empty, hollow shell. The failure of Congress to assert itself in matters of war and peace is actually a huge political scandal in American history. It's a turning point. It's a terrible aspect of our modern history. So, yes, I think Congress could play a very substantial role in our war in Iran and in restraining our excesses in other foreign policy disasters that we followed. But I don't see any prospect that Congress can do that or will do it. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to renovate, to use a nice word, our political class. I won't say decapitate. That was the word that we used before. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this new reality that's come out of this, how do you see what it's done to Israel and what Israel's future is going to be because of this?
So the question was about Israel. What effect does this new reality in Iran have to do with Israel? I think it has a big effect on Israel. The Israelis have often felt, just like Americans, when we have so much military power, we can work our will. We can do whatever we want. But now they're finding out that that actually isn't true. I think Israel is in a period of real, I don't want to say shock, but they're seeing a situation that they never expected. It's the same idea that Trump said. We were shocked. They fought back. So I do think that Israel's ambitions for dominance in the Middle East have been shattered by this war. I also think that this war, in conjunction with what has happened in Gaza, has had a tremendous, long overdue effect on American public opinion. It is truly dramatic to read polls and listen to members of Congress talking about Israel in ways they never did before. So actually, for the United States to begin to build a foreign policy in the Middle East that is based around the interests of the United States, rather than around the interests of Israel, would be something dramatically new. And I think there's not yet an eruption, but there's rumbling under the surface in the political class, even in what we call the Epstein class, that the relationship with Israel has gotten out of hand. And I do think that it may not restrain Israeli behavior, but it may lead the Israelis to believe we have to do this ourselves now. And, you know, I don't like that, but what I really hated about what was happening in Gaza was, as an American, the American role. We're sending plane loads full of bombs over there every day to be dropped on Palestinian kids. Now, if Israel wants to do that, Israel is going to do what Israel's going to do. Israel is what Israel is. But we're Americans. We should not be participating in this way. Yes.
Well, thank you for a really informative presentation and filling in a lot of blanks. I knew a fraction of what you said, and I appreciate that. If you could talk about the three H's, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and the relationship with Iran and the relationship with the countries that they find themselves in.
So the question is about Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis. We often see them described as Iranian proxies. Proxy is not the right word. There is a relationship, no doubt. But I want to pull back and explain what's the connection between Iran and these groups. So Iran is the center of Shia Islam in the world. And Iran has always, since 1501, when Shiism was declared the national religion of Iran, seen itself as the defender of Shia in the world. Now, wherever you go in the Middle East, the Shia are the poor people. If you go to Lebanon, if you go to Beirut, you go to the poor slums, the poor people, they're Shia. When you hear about Israel attacking Hezbollah strongholds, what they mean is Shia neighborhoods. So Iran has always seen itself as the defender of the Shia in other countries. Hezbollah emerged as the defender of the Shia in Lebanon. And although we see them as a military organization, and they certainly are that, they're much more than that. They are a huge social service network in a country where there are no social services. So if you're a poor widow and can't find food for your children and you're a Shia woman in Beirut, you can't go to City Hall. There is no City Hall. There is no infrastructure or safety net. But you can go to the Hezbollah office and they'll take care of you somehow. So Lebanon is a very weak state. Lebanon is unable to defend itself against Israel. And Hezbollah has taken that role on. And Hezbollah is supported by Iran as the defender of the Shia. The Houthis are a different situation. They're on the other side of the Gulf in Yemen. They are also not 12er Shia, exactly like the ones in Iran, but they are Shia offshoots. Now, we call them a kind of a rebel group, but actually they are the government. The real so-called internationally recognized president of Yemen hasn't been in Yemen for 10 years. He lives in Saudi Arabia. He's basically a prisoner of Saudi Arabia. So it's the Houthis that run the country. And they are also part of this informal Shia alliance. Hamas is a little different. Hamas is not Shia-based. And the Iranian connection to Hamas is not as substantial as the Iranian relationship with Hezbollah or with the Houthis. In fact, in Iran, there's a lot of popular unhappiness about Iranian government support for Hamas. You often hear people in Iran saying, we shouldn't be giving any money. We need too much money at home. Why are we sending all this money to Palestine? I think the one tie that Iranians feel to Hamas is that they're both victims of Israel. But it's not as emotional a tie as certainly the tie to Hezbollah and to a certain extent the Houthis. But here's a little clue. I learned this when I was in Turkey, and also you see the same thing in Syria, where you have Alawites. These are also Shia offshoots. The sword of Ali. Ali is the great, most perfect man who ever lived other than Muhammad, the first great martyr in the Shia faith. Ali had a sword, and his sword famously has, it doesn't come to a single point, it comes to 2 points at the end. And one of the things that binds all these groups together is that when they go into their prayer houses or community houses, you'll see a sword, an image of a sword on the wall, and it has 2 points. That's the clue. They're Shia or Shia related. And those are the ones that become the target for Israel and the United States. There's also this mistaken view, and I think that has emerged in some parts of the world, including the United States. There's 2 groups of Muslims. There's the Sunni and the Shia. The Sunni are the moderates. The Shia are the radicals. This is complete nonsense. Both of them run the gamut from extremism to total moderation. But Shia Islam is a very powerful force in the Middle East, and the more Iran emerges, the more powerful it becomes. Having said that, though, I want to go back to something I said earlier. The new regime in Iran is not so religious. It's not based on religion. And one of the greatest conflicts inside the Iranian mind for the last 1,000+ years has been, are we essentially Persian or are we essentially Muslim? It goes back and forth. When leaders of Iran receive foreign dignitaries, sometimes they would have pictures of Ali and Hussein in the background. Then regime would change and you see pictures of Persepolis things that were way before the Muslim conquest. So I think what you're seeing now is a putting aside a little bit inside Iran of the Shia idea, the Muslim idea, and the dominance of nationalism. And I think that is going to shape the future of Iran and the future of its relations with the rest of the world. Well, I think we are about ready to close up the library. I love being here. I love librarians. I love peace organizations. I loved making this trip. Thank you for having me.